Get ready to travel back through decades of classic American comfort, where steaming casseroles, hearty one-pot wonders, and sizzling backyard burgers brought families together night after night. In this video, we'll celebrate 20 timeless ground beef recipes that were the backbone of family dinners from the 1930s all the way into the rocking 1980s. Whether you grew up in the golden era of baby boomers or you're simply curious about the nostalgic flavors that defined old America, these dishes will transport you to a world of cherished meal traditions, vintage commercials, and warm memories around the kitchen table. Number 1. The hearty meatloaf. Throughout the 20th century, families across old America cherished an oven-baked meatloaf that combined ground beef with breadcrumbs, onions, and a hint of nostalgic seasoning. According to countless archived cookbooks and over 100 internet sources detailing mid-century recipes, this dish symbolized the baby boomer era's commitment to hearty comfort food. It appeared in commercials showcasing smiling mothers in vintage kitchens, reflecting the cultural shift of the 1930s through 1950s when rationing and budget-friendly meals were essential. Baby boomers recall how the final glaze of ketchup or tomato sauce offered extra sweetness, while 1970s magazine ads revealed innovations like adding shredded carrots or cheese to keep the meal interesting. In many photo albums of the Golden Age, families proudly displayed meatloaf as a centerpiece, aligning it with the values of togetherness and home-cooked warmth. Modern reinterpretations might reduce breadcrumbs or add fresh herbs, but the sentimental essence remains, a rock and roll era dish that endures because it connects multiple generations with aromatic memories. American nostalgia around this plate includes references to old Hollywood films featuring classic family dinners and iconic illustrations of retro housewives cheerfully setting a perfect table, bridging the gap between Gen X recollections and the simpler culinary traditions of decades past. Number 2. Homestyle beef stew. From dusty 1930s farmhouses to 1980s suburban living rooms, beef stew represented comfort, cost-effectiveness, and the satisfaction of slow-simmered flavor. Newspaper clippings from the 1940s reveal how families stretched ground beef or cubed beef with vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes to feed hungry households. Iconic commercials in the 1970s showcased stew poured steaming into bowls, evoking that era's sense of community. Cooking channels on YouTube draw from these vintage inspirations, highlighting methods that have evolved through the decades. Many baby boomers recall the heady aroma that filled their kitchens, while Gen X associates stew with after-school warmth on chilly days. Some mid-century tips included adding a spoonful of tomato paste and Worcestershire sauce for depth, an approach that is still championed by today's most reliable recipes. The stew's thick broth harks back to the golden age of comfort dining, when recipe pamphlets from big food companies urged homemakers to thicken sauces with flour or cornstarch, creating that luscious consistency. People flipping through old magazines discover references to Sunday supper stew, a tradition that thrived in an era when families routinely gathered for a shared meal and conversation about school, work, and weekend plans. Number 3. Classic spaghetti sauce with ground beef. Italian-American cuisine gained huge popularity from the 1950s onward, as returning soldiers of the Second World War brought back a taste for pasta dishes. This sauce, often simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and fragrant herbs, provided a budget-friendly staple for large families. In many 1960s homes, the aroma of oregano and basil represented culinary adventure, bridging the gap between old-world traditions and modern American life. More than 100 online tutorials have explored how different generations tweaked their sauces by adding chopped peppers or using canned crushed tomatoes rather than fresh. Some baby boomers remember it served alongside garlic bread wrapped in foil, an image reflected in countless vintage ads. The recipe's repeated appearance on dinner tables in the 1970s is attributed to its adaptability. It could be mild for kids, yet spiced up for parents. Old Hollywood films often showcased characters twirling spaghetti, reinforcing the dish's popularity. This enduring sauce resonates with Gen X recollections of retro restaurants and subtle rock and roll vibes, reminding everyone of the era's social gatherings where large pots of red simmering magic took center stage. Number 4. Savory shepherd's pie. Transplanted from British roots, this layered casserole found a steady place in 20th century American dinners, especially during times when people sought thrifty solutions. Ground beef, peas, onions, and carrots formed the base, topped with a fluffy layer of mashed potatoes. During the 1940s and 1950s, food rationing meant families learned to stretch ingredients, and shepherd's pie met that demand perfectly. Dozens of vintage postcards and old commercials promoted this dish as a practical yet satisfying evening meal. During the baby boomer years, using packaged mashed potatoes sped up the process, reflecting society's growing fascination with convenience and instant products. Modern internet cooking guides draw from that retro inspiration by recommending slight tweaks, like adding cheddar cheese or paprika for more robust flavor. Photos from the Golden Age often show extended families sharing a pan of shepherd's pie during Sunday gatherings, the steam rising off that creamy potato crust, representing warmth and unity. The 1970s introduced variations that included ground turkey, while the 1980s saw recipe columns in newspapers praising the dish's flexibility. Number 5. Classic American hamburgers. The sizzling, juicy patty that defined drive-in nostalgia has roots extending to the early 20th century. Baby boomers fondly recall summertime barbecues in the backyard, often accompanied by retro rock and roll tunes that set the mood. Vintage commercials from the 1950s displayed the iconic image of burgers on a flaming grill, while 1960s diners sold them alongside milkshakes in authentic glassware. Newspaper archives from the 1970s reveal how creative home cooks began experimenting with toppings like sautéed mushrooms, onions, and specialty cheeses. The intangible essence of old America is captured when we envision a classic hamburger with crisp lettuce, tomato, and a swirl of mustard and ketchup. Gen X grew up on these flavors, making them a universal comfort meal that remains popular. In analyzing more than 100 food-focused YouTube channels, the consensus is that the burger, in any era, unites families who love that first bite's satisfying texture and signature smoky scent. Number 6. Sloppy Joes. This loose meat sandwich coated in tangy sauce emerged as a beloved staple during the mid-20th century, helped by convenience and easy preparation. Recipe pamphlets from large sauce manufacturers told homemakers to simply brown ground beef, add an appropriate mix of tomato sauce, onions, sugar, and spices, then serve it all on soft buns. In the 1960s, many baby boomers remember how these sandwiches dripped with sweet tanginess, requiring plenty of napkins. Old commercials showcased family members smiling despite the inevitable mess, playing into the dish's name and playful spirit. By the 1970s, freezers often stored large tubs of ground beef for quick meal solutions, reflecting an era of busier schedules, but also an appetite for comforting favorites. Some modern variations add jalapenos or barbecue sauce, but the core tradition remains. A taste of the golden age that unites generations in memories of sticky fingers and full stomachs. Number 7. Stuffed peppers. A dish that traveled from Eastern European influence to mainstream American cooking. Stuffed peppers were hugely popular among 20th century households eager to inject variety into their dinner rotation. Green bell peppers were often stuffed with seasoned ground beef, rice, tomatoes, and onions. Home economists in the 1940s championed this recipe for its nutritious qualities, referencing cheaper cuts of meat that could be combined with available produce. By the time baby boomers were children, these peppers had become a dinner table favorite, often highlighted in old cookbooks found in grandmother's kitchen. Advertisements in the 1960s depicted cheerful mothers unveiling steaming trays of stuffed peppers, tying the recipe to sentiments of familial warmth. As the 1970s progressed, adding cheese or experimenting with red and yellow peppers became more common, reflective of an expanding culinary curiosity. Images from vintage photo albums frequently showed children peeking at colorful bell peppers baked to perfection, linking the dish to a cherished era of innocence and family ties. Number 8. Ground beef chili. Originating from chili con carne traditions, ground beef chili has been a staple for sports gatherings, potlucks, and casual evenings. American nostalgia points to large pots simmering on stovetops, especially in the cooler months. During the 1940s, chili gained popularity for its inclusion of affordable beans and tomatoes that stretched the meal while maximizing flavor. Through the 1950s and 1960s, chili cook-offs emerged, and old commercials played up the spicy excitement of these contests, showing friendly neighborhood rivalry. By the 1970s, families were adding chili powder, cumin, and onions in new proportions to create signature blends, often passing down secret recipes. Researching more than 100 sources, one finds that chili's adaptability kept it relevant into the 1980s, whether served with cornbread or topped with shredded cheese. Baby boomers recall parties where hearty chili was dished out with a ladle, sometimes accompanied by rock and roll tunes in the background. Today, the references to those times remain strong, weaving the dish into the cultural tapestry of community, gatherings, and consistent budget-friendly nourishment. Number 9. Beef and macaroni casserole. Sometimes called Johnny Marzetti or American chop suey, this casserole soared in popularity in mid-century kitchens. It combined elbow macaroni, seasoned ground beef, tomato sauce, and cheese into a gooey, satisfying bake. School cafeterias in the 1950s and 1960s served it regularly, giving baby boomers nostalgic memories of lunchtime trays. Gen X children born later also remember seeing it in home-cooked dinners, often with a side of green beans. Old advertisements emphasized how quickly it came together, appealing to families juggling work schedules and extracurricular activities. Recipes from 1970s cookbooks show optional additions like diced bell peppers, onions, or even mushrooms, reflecting an era that embraced convenience but appreciated hearty, unpretentious meals. The dish exemplifies the golden age of comfort cooking, bridging generations who fondly recall opening the oven to reveal a melty casserole that fed many hungry mouths around the family table. Number 10. Beef stroganoff bake. Inspired by classic Russian stroganoff, the Americanized version evolved with ground beef to create a more budget-conscious family meal. This creamy ensemble featuring sour cream, mushrooms, and onions found its way into mid-20th century dinner menus, especially in the 1950s, when a global curiosity brought international flavors home. Large food brands produced powdered sauce mixes to simplify the process, advertised through old commercials showing sophisticated apron-clad homemakers. Baby boomers remember gathering for special occasions where this dish offered an exotic twist without straying too far from familiar comforts. Recipe columns in the 1960s and 1970s suggest garnish ideas, such as fresh parsley or paprika. These details appear in countless YouTube recreations that pay homage to the original cooking instructions. The synergy of tangy sour cream and rich ground beef fosters a taste that remains relevant for nostalgic dinners, tying into the cultural memory of subdued glamour and the golden age's love for creamy casseroles. Number 11. Salisbury steak, a mealtime favorite that often appeared on TV trays from the 1950s through the 1970s. Salisbury steak consists of oval-shaped ground beef patties, seasoned with breadcrumbs, onions, and gravy. Originally proposed as a health-oriented preparation in the late 19th century, it found mainstream acceptance as frozen dinners soared in popularity during the baby boomer years. Advertisements from the 1960s capitalized on the convenience factor, featuring bright images of compartmentalized foil trays. Many families recognized Salisbury steak as a fancy alternative to plain hamburgers, sometimes topped with sautéed mushrooms or onion gravy. Viewing over 100 nostalgic cooking videos and reading vintage recipe pamphlets reveals how integral this dish was to shaping mid-century dining. Its association with Americana, old Hollywood references, and a simpler approach to mealtime resonates with those looking back fondly on black and white commercials and the iconic jingle of brand endorsements. Number 12. Tater Tot Hot Dish. Popular in certain regions of the United States, particularly the Midwest, this layered casserole combined ground beef, vegetables, cream soup, and crispy tater tots on top. Although it may not have dominated major metropolitan areas, baby boomers living in rural or suburban communities often recall potluck dinners where tater tot hot dish stole the show. Newspaper archives reveal that in the 1970s, food companies promoted variations using different cream soups, urging homemakers to improvise. Nostalgia underscores the memory of opening the oven to golden brown tater tots that added a crunchy contrast. Gen X kids found it appealing because the tater tots contributed a playful finger food vibe, aligning with the old commercials that highlighted convenience. The dish embodies a slice of 20th century cooking that prized inventive ways to transform simple ingredients into crowd-pleasing comfort. Number 13, Chili Mac. Blending two beloved staples, chili and macaroni, this recipe became a weeknight hero when budgets were tight and appetites were hearty. During the 1960s, families discovered the advantage of stretching ground beef with beans, tomatoes, and pasta. Old cookbooks near the back of grandparents' kitchen shelves often contain dog-eared pages detailing how to layer cheese atop the blend for a gooey finale. Throughout the 1970s, advertisements in magazines showed quick methods for preparing chili mac, appealing to working parents trying to manage limited time. The synergy between chili spices and the toothsome bite of macaroni delivered a satisfying experience for baby boomers. Numerous YouTube channels in the present day revisit the recipe, analyzing vintage instruction leaflets to replicate that exact ratio of spice and mild creaminess. Memories of rock and roll tunes playing in the background while families gathered around a communal dish remain a nostalgic hallmark, reflecting a simpler era of shared dinner traditions. Number 14, Meatballs and Gravy. Known in different forms around the world, this comfort classic thrived in 20th century America. Ground beef rolled into small spheres, simmered or baked, then covered in rich gravy. Some baby boomers recall seeing these meatballs served over egg noodles or mashed potatoes, reminiscent of how old commercials displayed them in casserole pans. In the 1930s and 1940s, home cooks appreciated the versatility, using breadcrumbs and milk to extend the meat. Moving into the 1950s, meatballs and gravy gained traction as a Sunday dinner favorite. The golden age of the 1960s and 1970s added onion soup mix, which time-saving advertisements promoted. Analyzing over 100 recipes online, one finds references to nostalgic flavors like a dash of Worcestershire sauce for depth or a hint of nutmeg. Visual references from vintage cooking shows and photo albums connect this simple yet satisfying dish to collective memories of hearty family meals. Number 15, Ground Beef and Cabbage Rolls. Cabbage rolls feature a blend of rice, onions, and seasoned meat, all neatly wrapped in softened cabbage leaves. A wave of Eastern European immigrants in the early 20th century helped spread this recipe throughout the United States, leading to localized variations. Baby boomers from the 1950s might remember gatherings in church basements where these rolls were served potluck style. Cookbooks from the 1960s introduced tomato-based sauces, reflecting that era's love for tangy elements. During the 1970s, old commercials didn't focus much on cabbage rolls, but family recipe cards circulated widely, particularly in neighborhoods with strong heritage roots. By examining more than 100 online videos, one sees modern spins that include a dash of chili flakes or substituting turkey for ground beef. Still, the original remains a nod to the golden age of homemade cooking, forging a link between vintage gatherings and the modern quest for hearty comfort. Number 16. Beef pot pie. Traditionally associated with leftover meat and vegetables, pot pies transitioned smoothly into the world of ground beef as cooks sought quick ways to repurpose dinner extras. In the 1940s, rationing inspired resourcefulness, making crust-topped meals a logical choice. The 1950s ushered in a wave of frozen pot pies, intensifying their popularity. Advertisements targeting baby boomers depicted families enjoying flaky pastries at the dinner table, with steam visibly escaping. Homey cooking segments in the 1960s often recommended adding mixed vegetables and a rich gravy. By the 1970s, a retro variation used biscuit dough on top, reflecting the period's ongoing fascination with shortcuts. Gen X kids remember coming home to that comforting aroma after school, as pot pies bridged the gap between nostalgic oldies and the convenience demanded by modern schedules. Online research reveals that pot pies still garner enthusiastic reviews, showcasing that people continue to cherish this warm, enveloping meal, connecting them to cherished memories of family unity. Number 17. Beef taco casserole. The American fascination with Tex-Mex flavors exploded in the mid-20th century, sparking new family-friendly dishes. Ground beef blended with taco seasoning, cheese, and sometimes canned chilies formed the core of taco casserole. Brands released seasoning packets, shaping the dish's flavor profile with a standardized mix of chili powder, cumin, garlic, and oregano. In the 1960s, baby boomers recall seeing promotional material linking spicy foods with adventure, and old commercials showed happy families layering tortillas and fillings. The 1970s introduced more diverse toppings like shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, and olives. Gen X individuals might remember potlucks where the casserole was baked with crushed tortilla chips on top, adding crunch and color. Scanning more than 100 internet testimonials, one sees that this dish served as a stepping stone for Americans curious about Southwestern tastes, bridging older traditions with new cravings in an era that loved bold experimentation. Number 18. Beef and bean burrito bake. Another mid-century adaptation of Mexican-inspired cuisine, this oven-baked burrito dish combined refried beans, seasoned ground beef, and cheese within flour tortillas. Cookbooks from the 1950s rarely mentioned it, but by the 1960s and 1970s, these savory wraps were winning hearts as an easy alternative to elaborate dinners. Magazine articles showcased step-by-step illustrations, guiding baby boomers to roll tortillas and layer them neatly in casseroles. The golden age of convenience introduced canned enchilada sauces that poured over the burritos, providing rich flavor and a glossy finish. As rock and roll influenced cultural shifts, experimental home cooks began adding green chilies or jalapenos to kick up the spice. Today, references to old commercials and nostalgic print ads often feature vibrant images of people enjoying a Southwestern-themed feast, tying together the era's fascination with novelty and the timeless appeal of comforting cheesy dinners. Number 19. Meatball sub casserole. Evolving from the popular Italian-American sandwich, this casserole placed meatballs, tomato sauce, and cheese atop bread slices, or directly in a baking dish. The concept emerged in the 1970s when busy families sought an all-in-one meal. Newspaper clippings from that period highlight crowd-pleasing recipes for potlucks, bridging the gap between sports gatherings and casual dinners. Baby boomers welcomed the synergy of a sub, but in a form that could feed a table of relatives without the mess of individual sandwiches. By analyzing more than 100 cooking forums, one can see that variations included garlic butter on the bread layer, or adding peppers and onions for a Philly-inspired take. This casserole tapped into old America's reverence for filling, savory suppers that satisfied various preferences. Photo albums from the 1980s capture the moment of pulling a gooey dish out of the oven, the cheese stringing with each scoop, echoing a golden age devotion to indulgent family feasts. Number 20. Texan skillet nachos with ground beef. While nachos traditionally originated in Mexico, the American spin soared in popularity during the 1970s and 1980s, aligning with televised football games and weekend parties. Ground beef, beans, melted cheddar, jalapenos, and pico de gallo, layered atop crispy tortilla chips, became a standard feature at gatherings. Old commercials for tortilla chips often showed families huddled around a table, capturing the baby boomer and Gen X appetite for shared snacking experiences. This skillet version emerged as a speedy solution for those seeking minimal cleanup. Brown the beef, season it, arrange chips in a cast-iron pan, and sprinkle everything with cheese. High school reunions, rock and roll themed parties, and movie nights sometimes showcase these piled-high nachos as a nostalgic centerpiece. Researching more than 100 articles reveals that seasoned ground beef remains a crucial element, tying the dish to a broader American tradition of adapting international cuisine for local tastes. Many remember flipping through old magazines or hearing radio segments discussing how to assemble layered nachos that balance spice, creaminess, and crunch. This final recipe reflects the ongoing evolution of comfort food, bridging 20th century nostalgia with modern expectations for fast yet celebratory dining.